Loretta Young wore virtue like armor. Wearing virtue is easy when the world thinks you are perfect. The ballroom glittered like a cathedral made of light. March 20th, 1948, the 20th Academy Awards, Shrine Auditorium, Los Angeles. Loretta Young sat in the audience, 35 years old, hands folded perfectly in her lap, spine straight as a candle, smile serene as a saint in stained glass. She was the picture of Hollywood grace, the embodiment of everything the industry wanted women to be: beautiful, modest, morally impeccable, Catholic, and utterly beyond reproach. She wore a gown that photographers would call angelic, white silk that caught the light like prayer made visible, a dress designed not to seduce but to sanctify. Her hair was pulled back in a style that suggested a halo more than Hollywood. Around her sat the industry's elite, directors, producers, stars whose scandals had been carefully managed or buried, men whose crimes had been laundered into legends. When they called her name, Best Actress for The Farmer's Daughter, the audience erupted in applause that sounded like absolution. Loretta Young rose with practiced grace, walked to the stage with steps that seemed choreographed by angels, accepted the golden statue with a smile that revealed nothing of the performance happening beneath the performance. Her acceptance speech was brief, humble, grateful. Even her gratitude was rehearsed. She thanked God first, as everyone expected. She mentioned her family, her director, her craft. She did not mention the 12-year-old girl waiting at home, the child with Clark Gable's unmistakable ears and smile, the daughter she'd introduced to the world as her adopted child, the secret that sat in her throat like a stone she'd been swallowing for 13 years. The cameras loved her. America loved her. The Catholic Church held her up as proof that Hollywood wasn't entirely corrupt, that a woman could be a star without compromising her virtue, that purity and success could coexist in the den of sin that was the film industry. Nobody knew that virtue in Loretta's case wasn't a choice. It was a prison she'd been sentenced to without trial, for a crime she didn't commit. Later that night, alone in her bedroom, Loretta Young locked the door, removed the white gown that had made her look like an icon, and wept. Not tears of joy or triumph, tears of exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning on dry land. Of rage she couldn't express because Catholic women don't express rage. Of shame she didn't deserve but carried anyway because someone had to carry it, and powerful men never do. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw what she always saw: a woman playing a role she could never escape, a saint built from silence, a performance that had consumed her entire life until there was almost nothing left underneath it. My silence was my sin and my shield. Hollywood built saints the way it built stars, out of silence and suffering. Was this really a woman who'd maintained her virtue through decades of Hollywood temptation? Or was it something far more painful? What if the image of perfection was constructed to hide an assault, a pregnancy? A truth so dangerous that revealing it would destroy not just her career but everything she'd been taught to believe about herself, about God, about what happened to women who named their violations. And in a world that worshipped female purity while punishing female victims, how does a woman survive when she can't tell the difference between her sin and her salvation? Because Loretta Young didn't choose silence. Silence chose her, and it held her captive for 70 years until even death couldn't fully release her from the role she'd been forced to play. She wasn't born a saint. She was born Gretchen Michaela Young on January 6, 1913 in Salt Lake City, Utah. A Catholic girl in a Mormon city, already marked as different, already learning that belonging required performance. That acceptance meant hiding parts of yourself that didn't fit the narrative others needed you to inhabit. Her father abandoned the family when Gretchen was 3, leaving her mother Gladys to raise 4 children alone during an era when single motherhood meant poverty, shame, and social death. Gladys moved the family to Los Angeles, chasing survival in a city that ate desperate women alive and called it opportunity. She found work as a switchboard operator, but it wasn't enough to feed 4 children. So she did what desperate mothers in Los Angeles did in 1916. She put her beautiful children in front of cameras, trading their childhoods for the possibility of rent money and regular meals. Gretchen, who would become Loretta, appeared in her first film at age 3. Not because she dreamed of stardom or loved performing, but because her family needed to eat, and her face was the only asset they possessed. By age 4, she was a regular child actor, learning before she could read that her value resided in her appearance, that love and survival were conditional on maintaining an image, that the self beneath the performance was less important than the performance itself. By 14, she'd transitioned to ingenue roles, her beauty already fully formed in ways that made grown men look away in shame at their own thoughts. The studios loved her, young, Catholic, obedient, with a face that suggested virtue and eyes that had already learned to reveal nothing of what she'd seen, what she'd learned about survival, what it cost to be the good girl in an industry built on consuming good girls. At 19, in 1932, Loretta Young signed with Warner Brothers. She was already a star, already playing the good girl in film after film, the moral center, the pure one, the character who represented what women were supposed to be while men around her did what men actually did. Studio executives praised her professionalism, her lack of scandal, her devotion to her faith. They had no idea they were building a cage and calling it a pedestal, constructing a prison from virtue and locking her inside before she understood what was happening. Her mother had taught her well. Guard your reputation like your life depends on it, because it does. Never let them see you struggle. Never admit weakness. Never ever do anything that might stain the image of Catholic perfection that keeps you employed, keeps your family fed, keeps you safe in an industry designed to destroy women who step out of line or speak uncomfortable truths. Could a child actor raised to perform from age 3 ever learn to distinguish between who she was and who she was paid to be? When survival depends on being what others need you to be, does authentic selfhood even have space to exist? And what happens when the performance becomes so convincing that even you forget it's a performance, when the mask and the face beneath it fuse together until removing one would destroy the other? The girl who'd learned to cry on cue was about to learn how silence performs better than tears. In 1935, Loretta Young was 22 years old and already carrying the weight of being Hollywood's moral exemplar. She'd appeared in over 60 films, had become one of the most bankable stars in the industry, was known for turning down any role that might compromise her Catholic values. Directors joked that her contract should include a virtue clause. Producers called her difficult but profitable. The Catholic Church considered her a triumph, living proof that faith could survive Hollywood. That year, she was cast opposite Clark Gable in Call of the Wild, a Jack London adaptation to be filmed on location in Mount Baker, Washington. Gable was already the king of Hollywood, charismatic, powerful, married to his second wife Rhea, and known for affairs with co-stars that the studios carefully managed or buried depending on how the publicity might play. He was everything Loretta had been taught to avoid: divorced, remarried outside the church, morally complicated, accustomed to getting what he wanted and operating in a system that gave him permission to take. The production was grueling. Remote location, harsh weather, long days filming in freezing conditions. The cast and crew stayed in a small lodge, isolated from civilization, from the studio machinery that usually maintained careful distances between stars, from the chaperones and publicity people who normally controlled every interaction. Loretta, as always, kept to herself, professional, polite, but maintaining the distance that had become her survival strategy in an industry where closeness meant danger. One night, after a long day of filming, Loretta was in her room. There's a knock at the door. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, charming, insistent. What happened next, Loretta would spend 70 years trying to find language for, trying to understand, trying to reconcile with her Catholic faith that taught her women bore responsibility for men's sins, that if a man desired you, it was somehow your fault, that your body was a site of sin you must guard, but also that men's inability to control themselves was ultimately your moral failing. It wasn't an affair, it was an assault. She would say this finally at age 85 to her daughter. Not seduction, not romance, not the passionate love story that Hollywood mythology would later try to construct when rumors began circulating. An assault, a violation, a moment where the most powerful man in Hollywood took what he wanted from a 22-year-old woman who'd been raised to believe that women's bodies were sites of sin, that if a man desired you, it was somehow your fault, that naming what happened would destroy you more thoroughly than the act itself ever could. Gable returned to his wife. The film wrapped. The film kept rolling. Hollywood never yells cut when the scene is violence against a woman. Loretta returned to Los Angeles carrying more than memories. She was pregnant. In 1935, pregnancy outside marriage wasn't just scandal. It was career death, especially for a Catholic actress whose entire marketability depended on her image of purity. Abortion was illegal, and for Loretta, morally impossible given everything she'd been taught about sin and salvation. Revealing the pregnancy meant revealing what Gable had done, which meant either being called a liar, he was the king, she was just an actress who would believe her, or being blamed for tempting him, for not resisting hard enough, for whatever it was that women always got blamed for when powerful men violated them. The studio machinery swung into action. Not to protect Loretta, to protect their investment in her image, and more importantly, to protect Clark Gable. Studio executives decided on a solution that would preserve both stars' marketability. Loretta would go to Europe for her health. She would disappear from public life for several months. She would return having adopted a baby girl from an orphanage. The story would be that Loretta, so generous and Catholic and pure, had rescued an orphan out of Christian charity. Every detail was calculated. Every lie was layered with enough truth to be believable. And Loretta, at 22, already exhausted from a lifetime of performing, already taught that women's survival depended on protecting male power, already trained to smile through pain, Loretta agreed. Because what choice did she have? Tell the truth and be destroyed? Or perform the lie and survive? Behind all that carefully maintained perfection, was there an unbearable anguish nobody saw? Could a woman raised to believe that purity was her only value survive learning that she'd been violated and would be blamed for it? And what does it do to a soul to love a child who is evidence of your trauma? To raise your daughter as your adopted child? To live every day with a secret that grows heavier with each year of mandatory silence? Loretta Young vanished from Hollywood in late 1935. The studio fed carefully crafted stories to the press. She was exhausted from her demanding schedule, needed rest, was traveling abroad for her health and spiritual renewal. Fans sent letters wishing her well. Priests included her in their prayers. Gossip columnists, usually so eager to uncover scandal, reported only what the studios wanted them to report. Nobody questioned the narrative because Loretta Young had never given them reason to question anything about her. She was the good girl. Good girls don't lie. She gave birth on November 6, 1935, in a small facility far from Los Angeles, away from cameras and columnists and anyone who might recognize her. A girl. Judy. Who had Clark Gable's ears, his smile, his unmistakable features. She gave birth not in light, but in shadow. No baptism, only erasure. Loretta looked at her daughter and felt love mixed with horror, devotion mixed with despair, maternal instinct mixed with the sickening awareness that this child was proof of what happened. Living evidence that couldn't be hidden. A truth that would have to be lied about for the rest of both their lives. Loretta placed Judy temporarily with nuns at an orphanage. Not abandoning her, but creating the appearance of adoption. building the lie that would protect them both. She returned to Hollywood after several months, resumed her career, played the gracious star returning from recuperation abroad. Then months later, she adopted a baby girl named Judy, introduced her to the world as a charitable act of Catholic compassion, and began the performance that would consume the rest of her life. Mother and daughter pretending they were something other than what they were, living a lie so complete it became more real than reality. The studios were pleased. Loretta's image not only survived, it improved. She was now both a saint and a mother, both morally pure and maternally devoted. The Catholic adoption narrative made her even more marketable to religious audiences, proof that Hollywood stardom and Christian values could coexist. Clark Gable's involvement was never mentioned, never suspected, carefully erased from every version of the story. The king's reputation remained untouched. The violated woman carried the secret alone, but Judy had Gable's face. As she grew, the resemblance became undeniable to anyone who looked closely. Hollywood insiders whispered. Columnists hinted in ways that stayed just short of accusation. Judy herself, growing up, would look at photographs of Clark Gable in magazines and see her own reflection staring back. She asked questions. Loretta gave answers that were technically true but emotionally false. He was a man I admired once, but not anymore. True enough to pass as honesty, vague enough to avoid confession. It wasn't until Judy was in her 20s that she began to suspect the truth. It wasn't until she was in her 50s that she confronted her mother directly, demanding to know who her father really was. And it wasn't until Loretta was 85, dying, that she finally spoke the words she'd spent 70 years avoiding. It wasn't an affair. It was an assault. I was too Catholic to see the difference then, too Catholic to name rape as rape, too Catholic to separate her trauma from her supposed sin, too Catholic to believe that what happened to her body wasn't somehow her fault, her responsibility, her cross to bear in silence, because good Catholic women don't make scenes or accusations or trouble for powerful men. Did this secret mark her downfall? Or was it simply the price she paid for survival in a system that protected powerful men while punishing victimized women? Could a Catholic actress in 1935 Hollywood have done anything differently and survived? And when silence becomes your only option, does it eventually become indistinguishable from complicity, from shame, from the thing that slowly kills you while keeping you alive? Loretta Young returned to Hollywood and became bigger than ever. Through the late 1930s and 1940s, she was one of the industry's most consistent stars, appearing in film after film, always playing variations of the same character. The good woman, the moral center, the one who makes sacrifices and maintains virtue while men around her do whatever men do. In 1940, she married Tom Lewis, a radio producer and advertising executive. It was her second marriage. The first, to Grant Withers when she was 17, had been annulled by the Catholic Church, wiped from official record as if it had never happened, another erasure in a life built on erasures. Tom Lewis was Catholic, respectable, willing to accept Judy as his adopted daughter without asking too many questions. On paper, Loretta had achieved what the Catholic Church prescribed: marriage, motherhood, morality. But the marriage was troubled from the beginning. Tom Lewis wasn't Clark Gable. He was weak where Gable was powerful, passive where Gable was aggressive, and Loretta couldn't help but measure every man against the one who'd violated her, couldn't help but see violence in intimacy, couldn't help but perform the role of devoted wife with the same skill she brought to her film roles. Convincingly, tirelessly, while dying inside, they had 2 sons together, Christopher and Peter. Loretta loved them, raised them Catholic, taught them the same performance of perfection she'd mastered, the same ability to hide pain behind appropriate exteriors. But Judy remained different. The adopted one, the one who didn't quite belong, the one whose face was a constant reminder of what Loretta couldn't forget and couldn't reveal. In 1947, Loretta starred in The Farmer's Daughter, playing a Swedish maid who becomes a congresswoman through honesty and integrity. The irony was suffocating. She played a character whose whole arc was about truth-telling and political integrity while living the greatest lie of her life off-screen. The role won her the Academy Award for Best Actress. When she accepted the Oscar wearing her white gown like a vestment, thanking God first and loudly, she embodied everything Hollywood wanted to believe about itself. That talent and virtue could triumph, that good girls could win without compromising, that the system rewarded those who played by its rules. Nobody in that audience knew what it cost her to stand there, to smile, to accept congratulations for a performance while living the greatest performance of her life every single day. Nobody knew that going home meant returning to a marriage that was slowly suffocating her, to a daughter who was asking increasingly difficult questions, to a silence that was becoming unbearable. Nobody knew that the Oscar she held represented everything she'd traded her truth for. Success built on a lie, acclaim earned through erasure, validation from a system that had violated her and then forced her to pretend the violation was somehow her fault. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw Loretta at her peak professionally, and her nadir personally. She appeared in religious films like Come to the Stable, 1949, playing a nun, the ultimate performance of holiness, the role she'd been playing in real life since childhood. Critics praised her natural grace, her inherent goodness, her ability to embody virtue without seeming artificial. Audiences loved her because she made virtue look easy, made sacrifice look beautiful, made suffering look noble. But suffering when it's real isn't noble. It's just suffering. It's waking up every day and putting on the costume of someone you're not. It's loving a child you can't publicly claim. It's performing purity while carrying shame you don't deserve. It's thanking God for blessings while wondering why God allowed you to be violated and then forced you to lie about it. Loretta started drinking. Not publicly, never publicly, but alone late at night when the performance finally ended and she could drop the mask for a few hours. She developed what would now be recognized as depression and PTSD, but in the 1950s was just called women's troubles or nerves or the price of being sensitive. She went to confession regularly, compulsively, trying to confess a sin she hadn't committed, trying to find absolution for being violated, trying to understand why God would let this happen to someone who'd tried so hard to be good. Her priests offered the same useless advice. Pray more, sacrifice more, offer your suffering to God, trust in His plan. None of them understood that Loretta's suffering wasn't spiritual. It was structural. She wasn't being punished by God. She was being crushed by a system that required women's silence for men's comfort, that turned victims into sinners and called it morality, that built pedestals for women and called them cages. In 1953, Loretta launched The Loretta Young Show, a television anthology series that would run for 8 years and win her 3 Emmy Awards. Each episode, she would make her entrance in a beautiful gown, spinning gracefully before the camera, an image that became iconic, that represented Hollywood glamour translated to the small screen, that millions of American families watched in their living rooms while Loretta performed perfection one more time. She was performing again, always performing, even at home, even with her children, even with herself. The performance had become so total, so consuming, that there was almost nothing left underneath it. She was Loretta Young, Catholic saint of Hollywood, and beneath that role was just a woman who'd been hurt and forced to pretend the hurt was holiness, that carrying a secret was somehow the same as carrying a cross. By the 1960s, her marriage to Tom Lewis was ending. They separated in 1963 and divorced in 1969, a divorce that required her to seek special dispensation from the Catholic Church to once again navigate the complex machinery of religious bureaucracy that always seemed designed to make women suffer more than men for the same acts. She married again in 1993 at age 80 to fashion designer Jean-Louis. This marriage, late in life, was reportedly happy. Or at least happier, a relationship built on companionship rather than performance, on mutual respect rather than the complicated dynamics of shame and violation that had defined her earlier relationships. But by then, Loretta had spent 80 years performing, and some habits are too deep to break entirely. She was still Loretta Young, still the saint, still carrying the secret that had become so much a part of her identity that revealing it felt like dying. Throughout these decades, Judy grew up in the strange space between privilege and lie, between being loved and being hidden, between having a famous mother and not being allowed to publicly claim that relationship. She got married, had children of her own, slowly pieced together the truth about her parentage through resemblance and rumor and the things Loretta wouldn't say. In 1994, Judy published a memoir, Uncommon Knowledge, that revealed the secret Loretta had spent a lifetime guarding. The daughter broke the silence her mother had mistaken for faith. The book described growing up as Loretta Young's adopted daughter, the slow realization that she was actually Loretta's biological child, the confrontation that finally forced truth into the open, and the complicated process of loving a mother who couldn't publicly acknowledge you, whose greatest performance was pretending you weren't her daughter. Loretta was devastated by the book's publication. Not because the secret was false, but because it was true, and truth was the one thing she'd been taught she could never afford. The revelation forced her to confront what she'd spent 8 decades avoiding. That what happened to her in 1935 wasn't her fault, that naming it as assault wasn't betraying her faith, that silence hadn't protected her. It had just preserved Clark Gable's reputation while destroying her peace. In her final years, Loretta Young began to speak more honestly, though even then she struggled against a lifetime of conditioning. She admitted to friends that she'd been naive about Gable, that she'd misunderstood what happened. She couldn't quite say the word rape, even at 85, even knowing intellectually that's what it was. The Catholic programming ran too deep, the belief that women bore responsibility for men's desires, that naming violation was somehow more shameful than carrying it in silence. She died on August 12, 2000, at age 87. In her bedroom, family members found her well-worn Bible, pages soft from decades of desperate reading. The same passages underlined over and over, the ones about forgiveness, about suffering, about carrying crosses. Tucked between 2 pages was a photograph of Judy as a young woman, her daughter, her secret, her shame that wasn't shame, her sin that wasn't sin, the living evidence of what had been done to her and what she'd been forced to do in response. Were those final years an act of surrender, or a courageous attempt, however incomplete, to finally speak truth after a lifetime of mandatory performance? Could a woman raised from age 3 to prioritize image over authenticity ever fully escape the role she'd been forced to play? Or was Loretta Young's entire life proof that some prisons are built from virtue, that sainthood can be a form of violence, that the most dangerous chains are the ones we're taught to wear proudly? After Loretta's death, the full story finally emerged without the careful management of studio publicity machines. Journalists, biographers, and historians began re-examining her life not as Hollywood hagiography, but as a case study in how the industry systematically protected powerful men while silencing victimized women. The truth became undeniable. Clark Gable had sexually assaulted Loretta Young in 1935. She'd become pregnant. The studios had manufactured an adoption story to protect Gable's image and preserve Loretta's marketability. And Loretta had spent 70 years living with a secret that was never hers to keep, bearing shame for a violation she didn't commit, performing virtue to hide a crime that wasn't her crime. Clark Gable died in 1960, celebrated as the king of Hollywood, his reputation intact. His assault of Loretta Young never mentioned in his obituaries, never considered relevant to his legacy. He was buried with full honors, mourned by millions, remembered as an icon of masculinity and charm. The crime he committed against Loretta was erased from his story because men's stories in Hollywood's golden age were written by other men who understood that some truths were better left buried, that protecting male power was more important than acknowledging female pain. Judy Lewis, caught between two famous parents who never publicly acknowledged her, spent her life trying to make sense of being the secret, of bearing a face that revealed what everyone pretended not to see. She became an actress and psychotherapist, turning her pain into purpose, her confusion into clarity for others who'd been damaged by family secrets and lies. She wrote honestly about the psychological damage of growing up as a lie, of loving a mother who couldn't publicly claim her, of bearing Clark Gable's face while being told to pretend she was nobody's daughter. When Judy died in 2011, obituaries finally told the full story. The press that had once protected Gable and perpetuated Loretta's silence now acknowledged the truth. This was a child born of assault, raised in secrecy, damaged by a system that prioritized image over humanity, profit over truth, male reputation over female well-being. Loretta Young's legacy is complicated, painful, and instructive. Film historians celebrate her performances, her Oscar win, her television success, her influence on fashion and style. Religious scholars point to her as an example of Catholic faith surviving Hollywood's moral compromises. Fashion historians study her glamorous aesthetic, her iconic entrances on The Loretta Young Show. But feminist historians see something else, a woman destroyed by the very system that claimed to exalt her, a victim forced to perform as a saint, a mother who couldn't publicly acknowledge her daughter, a survivor who was never allowed to name what she survived, an actress whose greatest performance was pretending that her violation was somehow her virtue. The Catholic Church that held her up as a model of faith offered her no mercy when she needed it most. The industry that built her image abandoned her emotional well-being to preserve male power. The fans who loved her innocence had no idea that innocence had been stolen from her, then weaponized against her, then sold back to her as the only thing that made her valuable. In recent years, movements like Me Too have prompted re-examination of cases like Loretta's. How many women in old Hollywood were assaulted by powerful men and forced to stay silent? How many pregnancies were hidden? How many careers destroyed? How many women told that speaking truth would ruin them more thoroughly than the assault itself? How many were given the choice between destroying themselves or performing a lie and then blamed for choosing survival? Loretta Young's story isn't unique, it's emblematic. She represents countless women who learned that in Hollywood's golden age, female virtue meant female silence, that purity was performed through suppression of truth, that the price of being a star was agreeing to be victimized without complaint, to carry shame for crimes committed against you, to spend your entire life in a prison built from the very qualities the world claimed to admire. The studios that protected Gable are long gone, but their legacy persists in every system that values male comfort over female truth. The Catholic morality that told Loretta her assault was somehow her responsibility still operates in countless variations. In every institution that teaches women their bodies are sites of sin they must guard, while men's inability to control themselves is somehow women's fault. The culture that punishes women for naming their violations while celebrating the men who commit them hasn't vanished. It's just evolved, adapted, found new ways to make the same old demands. Be beautiful, be silent, perform perfection, and never ever threaten male power by telling the truth about what they've done to you. Was Loretta Young's silence a choice or a sentence? The answer is both. She chose silence because every alternative was worse: career destruction, religious condemnation, being branded as a liar or a temptress, losing the only source of income and identity she'd ever known. But it was also a sentence. imposed by a system that made silence the only rational choice for a victimized woman who wanted to survive, that punished truth-telling while rewarding performance, that built cages from virtue and called them pedestals. She wasn't weak, she was trapped, there's a difference. She wasn't a liar. She was surviving the only way survival was possible. She wasn't a hypocrite. She was performing the role assigned to her by a system that gave her no other options and then blamed her for playing it. Hollywood wanted purity. She gave them a performance. And in return, they gave her 70 years of silence, a daughter she couldn't claim, a secret that consumed her life, and a legacy that would take decades after her death to finally, incompletely understand as what it really was. Not the story of a saint, but the story of a system that turns victims into icons and calls it virtue. The white dress from 1948 hangs in a museum now, preserved behind glass, a costume from a performance that never ended. The golden Oscar sits in an archive somewhere, metal monument to a lie told so well it became truth. The Bible with Judy's photograph tucked between its pages sits in a collection, evidence of a faith that was both genuine and weaponized, a belief system that gave her solace while imprisoning her in shame she didn't deserve. The white dress still glows behind glass. The applause has long stopped. Only the silence remains, and what it costs to keep it. The Shrine Auditorium has gone quiet now. The seat where she once sat shines under museum light, empty as her silence. Hollywood builds saints just to cage them in silence. What hidden truths might still remain buried in the official stories of old Hollywood? How many other saints were really victims? How many scandals were really assaults? How many women smiled for cameras while dying inside, performing virtue while carrying violations they could never name because naming them would destroy the very image that kept them alive? And when a woman spends her entire life performing perfection, when she smiles through assault and calls it duty, when she raises her daughter as her adopted child and calls it sacrifice, when she accepts an Oscar while her soul is screaming and calls it grace, who is responsible for that violence? The man who assaulted her? The studios that silenced her? The church that blamed her? The culture that demanded her smile? The audiences who consumed her performances while ignoring her pain? All of them. And none of them will ever be held accountable because the machinery that destroyed Loretta Young called itself morality, called itself protection, called itself the only way a good Catholic girl could survive Hollywood, called itself everything except what it was. A system designed to protect male power by requiring female silence, to preserve male legacies by erasing female truth, to celebrate male success by burying the crimes that enabled it. Does the world bear responsibility for loving an image while ignoring the woman dying beneath it? When we celebrate old Hollywood glamour, are we complicit in the violence that created it? And how many women are still performing perfection right now, still smiling through violations, still carrying secrets that will outlive them because speaking truth remains more dangerous than staying silent?